Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to everyone on the West Coast. I know it's still morning out there. Thank you so much for being a part of the Tattooed Historians Digital Conference today. We've had a great feedback from a lot of people, and we've had a great time doing this conference. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And I also want to thank my guest, Susan Brynne Long. Brynne, thank you so much for being on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Brynne is a first-year PhD student in the American Civilization program at the University of Delaware. She studies Colonial and Revolutionary America, and her current work focuses on prisoners of war during the Revolution, specifically their reception by various communities that were obliged by the Congress to host them during the war. Her conference paper looks specifically at Rutland, Massachusetts, 1776 to approximately 1783. The town was obliged by the Congress to host various captive groups, including some regiments of the Continental Army captured at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Brynne argues that while the Rutland town meeting readily supported the Patriot cause early in the conflict, hosting POWs caused a crisis of authority between it and the Continental Army over who was really in charge of the prisoners. In the end, for Rutland, upholding local autonomy outweighed its desire to unconditionally support the new national project. I know I have a lot of fans on here of the 18th century Brynne, so they are going to love your presentation. So thank you again for being on. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, John, and thank you to everyone here who is joining us to learn a little bit more about the American Revolution, about prisoners during the American Revolution. And I'm just going to share my presentation screen here.
Yeah.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Rutland's Rebellion, Defending Local Governance During the Revolution. And just before we get started here, I really just wanted to reiterate, thank you so much to John for all that he's done for the presenters today. He truly epitomizes the idea of when you get where you're going, turn back around and help the next person in line. So I'm really grateful to be here, and I hope that you all do enjoy the presentation. So here we go. Typically, countries at war do not detain enemy prisoners in the backyards of their citizens. During the Revolutionary War, Britain's soon-to-be independent North American colonies proved an exception to this rule. For the fledgling nation, the action was a matter of necessity, one which forced host towns across the colonies to confront the fight for American nationhood in a most unusual way. Today, I'm going to be telling you about the town of Rutland, Massachusetts. During the Revolution, every American victory came with the challenge of detaining more prisoners of war. These men, as well as Continental officials and guards, were hosted in rural towns throughout the colonies. Rutland was one such town. While in residence, Continental Army officials butted heads with local authorities over who was rightly in charge of the prisoners. Over the next 20 minutes, I will argue that in Rutland, this power contention resulted in the weakening of the town's local autonomy. So towards this end, I'm going to address 4 separate subjects for y'all today. First, I'm going to give just a brief history of Rutland and the situation that led to the town hosting prisoners during the Revolution. Then I'm going to describe the conflict that emerges between the Continental Army and the town meeting. And this actually precedes, of course, the arrival of the prisoners in 1778. Then I'm going to detail the disorganization in Rutland once the prisoners arrived. And how the town meeting's failure to police the situation in Rutland actually contributed to its loss of autonomy. And then finally, I'm going to relate the end of the prisoner experiment in Rutland and suggest that this history is vital to understanding the stakes of the revolution for local governance. First, history. Similar to many other New England towns, Rutland was locally governed from its earliest years. Even before there was an official government in the town, beginning in 1715, a single group of landowners governed Rutland's earliest settlers. In 1722, the Massachusetts Colonial Legislature, called the Great and General Court of Massachusetts, incorporated the town and empowered its leading citizens to establish a local form of government called a town meeting. This meeting governed Rutland autonomously for most of the 18th century. In the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, Rutland sided with the Patriot cause in various ways. In 1733, the town meeting received a copy of this, the Boston pamphlet, from the city's Committee of Correspondence. This pamphlet asked it and other meetings in the colony whether they would, quote, stand firm as one man to recover and support their colonial rights lately infringed upon by the British Parliament. The Rutland Town Meeting recognized the committee's list of grievances as, quote, agreeable to truth and justice, and vowed, quote, not only in the present, but in all future occurrences of this kind, to join with them in the defense of their charter rights and privileges. A year later, Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act of 1774. The act essentially dissolved the Massachusetts legislature and abolished the legality of town meetings. In response, outraged Rutlanders and other local patriots mobbed the home of John Murray, Rutland's representative to the General Court, for his support of the act. And just a quick little aside here, actually, if you're looking on your screen, you can see just above John Murray's kind of Leia, Princess Leia wig curl, you can see there's some damage to the painting. This actually was inflicted by a Patriot rebel during that mobbing that I just described. He put his bayonet through the expensive portrait, and of course the portrait does survive. It has since been repaired, but we can still see sort of the mark of his blasphemy, so to speak, in Rutland's history. So then, after this mobbing occurs in 1775, we have the skirmishes breaking out at Lexington and Concord, essentially the beginning of the Revolutionary War formally, and Rutland sent militiamen to fight, and they also allocated town funding for the care of the soldiers' wives. So what you're seeing here is a town that's very much engaged in the Patriot Project and is engaged in the American Revolutionary War sort of distantly in terms of just sending money and sending arms, but it's certainly a patriotic town that's prepared to support the revolutionary cause. In 1777, the American victory at Saratoga resulted in the capture of nearly 6,000 men. And when discussions with the British to exchange the captive soldiers under the ill-conceived Convention Surrender Agreement ultimately soured, Congress appointed Major General William Heath to find indefinite accommodations for the so-called Convention Army. In adherence with the rules of European warfare, Congress called for captives to be treated gently. Accordingly, enlisted men were to be confined in the barracks constructed within towns rather than in remote prisons, and officers were actually allowed to serve their detentions in residences, churches, taverns, and other private buildings. This local style of prisoner management led to contentions over authority between the Army and town meetings throughout the colonies. So I just want to be clear here. Of course, there are, issues that arise between the prisoners and the town meeting that are relevant and we talk about here in this paper. But what I'm zooming in on for the purposes of this particular project is the real contention you see emerging between the Continental Army that accompanies the prisoners and the town meeting. This is where you're sort of getting this very interesting clash of governmental interests that's emerging. So next, let's look at how these contentions that I've described are going to actually play out in Rutland. In December of 1777, Heath selected the town to serve as host for the convention prisoners of war. He sent army officials from Cambridge, including John Gooch, who was to be the quartermaster of the Rutland barracks, to make preparations for the relocation of the Convention Army prisoners. Gooch met resistance from townspeople almost immediately against housing the officers in their homes and private buildings. In response, the Massachusetts General Court ruled, quote, there being no rooms to be procured in Rutland aforesaid suitable for quartering the officers of the convention, the Committee of Correspondence, etc., in the town of Rutland, be hereby directed to deliver to Major General Heath the dwelling house lately owned and occupied by John Murray, for purposes of quartering such of the officers of the convention as he shall think proper. So thus, we see the home of Rutland's most hated Tory, John Murray, the ousted colonial representative, become a home for other hated Tories, captive British and German officers. After Gooch secured lease of the Murray house for the quartering of the officers, the town meeting members defied his authority to seize it. Gooch related to General Heath that one day upon his arrival to the house, he was met with the angry tenant of the home. The man, quote, armed himself with sword and musket, and indeed with a most terrific figure, and swore if I did not immediately quit the room, he would dispatch me. After a short standoff, the tenant calmed himself enough to retreat. And when he returned a short while later, Gooch reported to General Heath that he actually brought reinforcements with him, and they came in the form of 15 to 18 politicians whom I, quote, afterward found were under the directions of Deacon Howe and Major Clapp, who were leading members of the town meeting. Gooch related to Heath that the men then, quote, demanded of me by what powers I acted, And after presenting them with the documentation of his lease, they, quote, concluded I had no power to take possession till the 1st of May. The town meeting ultimately did relent on this particular occasion, but only by contractual obligation. Gooch ended his letter to Heath by saying that he hoped his letter would, quote, place in a proper light the disagreeable situation he was in between the civil and the military. So Gooch continued to face the hostility of the town meeting throughout the summer. In June, the meeting invited Gooch to a special session to discuss the impending prisoners. At the conference, he again encountered the resistance of the committeemen against his purposes, writing to General Heath, quote, instead of affording me the assistance I required, the town meeting made all the interest in their power to prevent the officers being quartered, and the first step taken was to put to vote whether they would admit the officers into the town. A large majority was for not admitting them on any terms. I informed them that by the convention agreement, the prisoners were to be quartered, and that my orders were to procure quarters, but I looked on the vote that they had then passed as of no consequence and should pay no regard to it, and that it was not in their power to support it unless they voted themselves superior to the legislative body to which they were, or ought to be, subordinate. I am subject to a set of men chosen into office from no other recommendation than that of being irrationally noisy. So Gooch considered himself, as a quartermaster in the Army of the Colonies together, to have the authority to relocate the convention prisoners to Rutland. The town meeting, as the sole government of Rutland since its founding, saw it as its right to refuse the entry of the prisoners. The body did not recognize the authority of the Continental Army as superior to its own on what members perceived to be a local issue. This disagreement meant that Continental officials often worked against and despite, rather than with, the Rutland town meeting. Now I will discuss how the meeting lost its autonomy further by failing to police its constituents once the prisoners actually arrived. The conventioneers began arriving in Rutland in late summer of 1778. Almost immediately, Rutlanders began causing difficulties for the Continental Army by price gouging. In early fall, Gooch wrote to Heath that the local sellers were Gooch wrote to Heath of the local sellers saying, quote, there is no bounds to their avarice. They even take pains to send all around the country to raise the price of all such articles as they think we shall stand in need of. They are so very greedy here. They are like a set of sharks waiting for every advantage. I often, when amongst them, fancy myself surrounded by a set of hungry devils. Gooch and other Continental officials also related to Heath that Rutlanders were hoarding the building materials necessary to construct the prisoner barracks. Recognizing that the town meeting was not cooperating with Continental officials and was failing to discipline the local population, Heath defaulted again to the Massachusetts General Court for its intervention. In response to the issues of Rutlanders hoarding building materials and raising prices, the court passed a resolution that empowered the Continental Army to seize brick and other supplies from private citizens. By overlooking and participating in opposition to the army, the town meeting was relinquishing local control to the state government. Despite this intervention, Rutlanders continued to defy the authority of the Continental Army by not complying with its rules. For example, enlisted prisoners were not allowed to leave the barracks. However, many captives later reported that they were enabled to do so by the locals. Upon his eventual escape from captivity, George Holmes of the 53rd Regiment of Foot reported to the British Army that he, quote, worked in different parts of the country at his trade as a shoemaker during his time in Rutland. Holmes was not the only one to enjoy such freedoms. Responding to Heath's order not to allow the prisoners out of the barracks except to collect provisions, on July 24, 1778, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Tyler wrote to the general, quote, I inform your honor that there are, as I am informed, a number of the convention troops by some means at work for the inhabitants of this and neighboring towns. I find the inhabitants are not only desirous of keeping them, as labor is very scarce, but are urgent for me to let out more. Heath responded by insisting, quote, I have only to repeat that it is my express order that they don't leave the barracks for work, as it is productive of many ill consequences too obvious to need mentioning. Despite this order, the insubordination of Rutlanders continued without intervention by the town meeting. Rutlanders also taxed the efforts of Continental officials by incessantly complaining about prisoner behavior, albeit apparently with good reason. Almost immediately upon the arrival of the convention prisoners, behavioral issues arose. In July, Colonel Joshua Davis reported to Heath that some prisoners, quote, "are not so civil as I could wish. For the past few days have been fighting in the evenings and insulting the inhabitants, as well as abusing some of our people." Officials also reported numerous fights and escapes. In response, Rutlanders complained often to Continental officials, exaggerating their reports of events and threatening retaliatory violence against the prisoners. Joshua Mercereau, the Deputy Commissary General of Prisoners for the Continental Army, was constantly distracted by complaints, writing, quote, "The inhabitants, selectmen, etc., waited on me twice to know whether the officers were permitted to go about the town on Sabbath days, some saying that if they came therein, they would shoot them. The town meeting and its members certainly would have been aware of this behavior and possibly even participated in it, but they did not police it." Becoming frustrated with the Rutlanders' insubordination and the lack of disciplinary action by the town meeting, Heath took a rare occasion to send the body a letter. In it, he requested their cooperation as the convention prisoners continued to arrive throughout the summer. The letter read in part, "The having these gentry so near to you will undoubtedly create much trouble and difficulty, but you would please to remember, gentlemen, that they must be somewhere. I am desirous that you would give all the aid and assistance in your power to the officer acting in the Quartermaster General's Department in the procurement of quarters for the officers from time to time." Heath received a lukewarm response from the meeting which read, "Were it in our power, sir, we should with the utmost cheerfulness afford every beneficial assistance in that way. But your honor will please to consider that dwelling houses in this and the neighboring towns are in general fitted rather for necessary family conveniences, and it seems the proprietors of the unutilized homes are determined upon principle not to admit any of those officers taking up quarters with them on any terms whatever, for which determination, sir, we do not pretend to censor them." The body's lack of enthusiasm over supporting the Army's local endeavors discouraged Heath from directly dealing with it in future. The correspondence would prove the only one between Heath and the Rutland town meeting during the war. In all future difficulties, Heath went straight to the Massachusetts General Court, superseding the town meeting's authority. The disagreeable situation between the civil and the military, to use Quartermaster Gooch's words, came to a head when the Rutland town meeting accused Joshua Mercereau of corruption following a slew of prisoner escapes at the end of the summer of 1778. Evidence of these escapes can be found in the Massachusetts Spy newspaper, in which Mercereau advertised a $10 reward per man for the return of prisoners Alexander Adamson, James Dowell, and James Mote. Despite this attempt, however, Mercereau still stood trial. The deputy denied the accusation of paid escapes in a letter to General Washington, dated August 31st, 1778, saying, quote, "I am confident that there is not an officer of the convention who can say that they have given me one single farthing." During the trial, Mercereau was formally cleared of charges. However, his legal clearance did not clear him in the eyes of his hosts, and he remained a public enemy in Rutland for the rest of his stay. To end, I will discuss the departure of the Continental Army and the prisoners from Rutland. Happily for Mercereau, on October 16, 1778, Congress resolved to send the Convention Army captives to Albemarle County, Virginia, for indefinite confinement. In November, the remaining convention prisoners, save for approximately 400 infirm and diseased men, set off on their march to Virginia. 579 British and German troops made their escape along the way. At least 2 men drowned during river crossings, and a few ultimately succumbed to the weather and illnesses. Once arrived, the surviving conventioneers stayed in Virginia for 3 years. The men endured the Convention Army's last transfer to Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1781. The conventioneers remained there for the rest of the war, whereupon the survivors were finally sent home. Rutland continued to host a small portion of the Convention Army, as well as prisoners of other conflicts until the war ended. In 1779, low provisions and a lack of guards made the local situation desperate. In an April letter to General Heath, Mercereau described, quote, "a deplorable situation" in Rutland, and lamented that the newly arrived guards were, quote, "almost all boys and children." Though Heath had since relinquished his control of the Eastern Department and the Convention Army to General Horatio Gates, Mercer pleaded that Heath exert his influence over the situation. Gates responded by ordering the conventioneers still in Rutland to be brought to Boston and secured in a prison ship. The remaining Rutland conventioneers were detained in Boston Harbor for the rest of the war, awaiting the sooner of death or exchange. When the war began, the Rutland town meeting happily sent men and money to the front, maintaining a short-lived, distant involvement in the conflict. Meanwhile, the Congress and the Continental Army had to manage an ever-growing number of captive soldiers. Rural towns like Rutland ultimately were the imperfect solution to this problem, with space to host the men and, in theory, ready provisions to support them. However, inhabitants and local leaders alike were not eager to welcome prisoners into their towns, and town meetings would not easily relent their authority to that of the Continental Army. Despite this, the revolution ultimately saw patriots seize power from Great Britain and local governments alike. By war's end, the Rutland town meeting's authority had been periodically superseded by that of the new state government, and its autonomy had been forcibly qualified by the Continental Army's management of the prisoner situation without the consent or advice of Rutland's leading men. The town meeting, defensive of its own authority, both participated in and overlooked Henderson behaviors to the Army's efforts. In so doing, it forced Continental officials to turn to the general court for local interventions. Rutland's unique history calls for a broader study of the towns that hosted prisoners of war during the American Revolution. For many colonial towns, the outbreak of war meant an ongoing threat to traditional forms of local government. The intense way in which Rutland responded to this threat draws attention to the local experiences of revolution and the forgotten pitfalls of the fight for colonial independence. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brynne, for that. It's really amazing. We have sometimes some issues with 18th century history in my neck of the woods. I mean, I'm not far from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, so I'm about maybe 2 hours away from Lancaster. And once in a while, we hear about the American Revolution and prisoners and such. What I would like to know is there's a question in here from Ryan Kaiser, and I kind of want to piggyback off of it. Can you tell us about what was the makeup of the Convention Army? What was the Convention Army compared to when we hear the British Army or British regulars versus Continentals? What was the Convention Army? And then Ryan's question on top of that with how many prisoners versus how many lived in town?
Yeah, so Rutland is actually a fairly small town. I can't give you an exact population off the top of my head, but a couple of thousand. The number of prisoners in Rutland, they didn't take the entire Convention Army. They did take a large portion of it, but General Heath was really just trying to do his best to disperse the men in areas where they would be far away from the fighting. And so if one particular town, you mentioned Lancaster, of course, Lancaster also took prisoners, and I talked about removals of the Convention Army to various parts of the colonies, soon to be states, throughout the Revolution. If one particular town got overloaded or, began to suffer from some of the issues that Mercer described in 1781 in terms of a lack of provisions or anything like that, then there would be movements that were made. Again, in terms of specific numbers in Rutland, I can't give those because I was never able to find them, and I've been researching this for about 2 years. There were just so many moving parts because it wasn't just the Convention Army that was in Rutland. I kind of got to this a little bit at the end, but we also have soldiers from the 53rd Regiment of Foot and soldiers from the 70th Regiment of Foot. So there were a lot of moving parts, but in general, the number of prisoners was either comparable to the number of people in the town, just regular citizens, or actually even in some cases exceeded, because of course the Convention Army, the number of prisoners that were brought to Rutland was in excess of 2,000. And so once they did come into Rutland, which is a relatively small town, and of course they're already joining an existing group of prisoners that are there, sometimes you do have a number that exceeds the number of civilians. So it could be quite overwhelming for a town of that size.
Is the Convention Army kind of like an allied army?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that's just what they were named. So when that's basically, the Convention Army refers to every British and British allied soldier that was captured at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Okay. So it was a quite large number. I believe it was in excess of I don't even want to put a number on it. A couple thousand. Again, I'm sorry.
No.
But it just refers to, the convention refers to the name of the agreement under which the British actually surrendered. So that's why they're called the Convention Army. And originally, under the terms of the convention, the army was going to be traded back to Britain under the agreement that they would never take up arms against the Americans again in the course of the present conflict. Mm-hmm. But Congress kind of got those papers and were like, what? Like, you can't just make guys promise not to shoot us. They're going to shoot us anyway. Right. So eventually what happened is the convention was scrapped. And aside from a couple of prominent British generals, including John Burgoyne, who were, transferred back to Britain from big name American prisoners, mm-hmm. most of the enlisted men and the officers became part of what was known as the Convention Army. Okay.
Piggybacking off that one more time, because we don't hear Convention Army a lot, especially when you're when you're talking with 19th century, 20th century historians, or like Convention Army. What's this? So Charlotte asked, what's basically the demographic of these soldiers at the time in the 18th century?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Charlie. So middle-aged, what's the question? Were they middle-aged men in their 20s, tradesmen, or were they professional soldiers?
Right. Yeah.
So this is actually going to be a mix of British and German or Hessian, depending on how you're going to refer to it, allied soldiers. So Britain, of course, is buying essentially men to fight in the army from the British or from the German states, most of them coming from Hesse-Kassel. So that's why they're called the Hessians. In that case, those are going to be professional trained soldiers. In the case of the British Army, it's going to be a mix of regulars and then also just men who took up when the war began. So you are kind of going to get a healthy mix. And again, because the Convention Army is just sort of a term that we apply to this group of men after the fact, it was not some specific, it was made up of various regiments. So you'll get some Scots in there, you'll get some British regulars, some people that just joined up, people in their 20s, I think is the phrase that Charlie had used. And then, of course, you are getting the professional soldiers with the Hessians.
Wow, that's an awesome topic of discussion. And you've said you've been working on it for 2 years now, this particular subject?
Yes, 2 years, roundabout.
That's awesome. And I do have to point out that next to you has been your new furry friend. And I thought that you should tell everyone what his name is. She has a puppy off screen for all the dog lovers out there.
I do have a puppy. I can bring him on screen to say hello.
Is he awake? Or?
Yes, well, we can wait.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
His name is Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, of course, won us the Battle of Saratoga. Okay, you can go up now. I love Benedict Arnold because he won us the Battle of Saratoga. He captured us the Convention Army. But sort of one of the shticks of this, when I do different versions of this talk, is that, of course, we think of the Battle of Saratoga as a turning point in terms of, positive change. We do have this victory and we do secure French support, but on the other side of it, you have the capture of literally thousands of men that need to be fed and housed. And what does that look like on the ground? It's not really very pretty at all. And you do see a lot of these contentions emerging between different competing governmental forces. So it's a turning point for many reasons, but it's not all good stuff.
Right. So what are your future plans for research topics? Do you want to build on this? Do you want to go a different route? Do you want to stick with Saratoga? What are your thoughts on that as you go through your doctoral process?
So currently, I've been working on actually loyalty oaths during the American Revolution. I think it's very interesting that we do think of the revolution as sort of, this moment of great liberty and victory for personal liberty, and we kind of conveniently overlook the fact that state governments, local governments like town meetings, and the Continental Army itself actually enforced loyalty oaths on civilians and military men alike throughout the conflict. And that's a really compelling idea to me. And why did they feel that was necessary? I suspect that the reason has to do with sort of perpetuating legitimacy in terms of governance. Of course, loyalty oaths have a long and rich history in European history and British history especially. So I think that that's what it is. But you never want to go in with a thesis already in mind. So I'm keeping an open mind and seeing what's going on with that, whether there's religious influences to that, and whether or not they were effective.
That's awesome. We have time for one last question here, and it's from YouTube, which is great because we never had a YouTube question on any of my presentations. So there we go. What books do you recommend on this topic in a broader sense? They also love you and Arnold.
Yes, thank you very much. So there's actually some great books on this topic. When I did get started on it 2 years ago, I was terrified because when I started on it, there were no books out about prisoners and the American management of British prisoners during the war. And I was like, yes, you find something.
Yeah.
I'm also an undergraduate at the time. So I'm like, what do I do? Right? Like, I can't publish a book. And then, between then and now, there have actually been 2 full-length books, to my knowledge, that have been published on this. If you are interested in Lancaster specifically, I would recommend Ken Miller's Dangerous Guests. It's a really fantastic community study of Lancaster and the way that this sort of management policy played out on the ground in that town specifically. He does not get into Rutland at all. I think it's kind of a blind spot. But that is a good book. That's the first to come out. And then just recently, truly, truly incredible book, Captives of Liberty by T. Cole Jones. This is a book that talks about sort of the violence of the American Revolution through the lens of prisoner of war management. It's really, truly a compelling piece of work, and it just came out a couple of months ago, so you'll be right on the cutting edge of history if you give it a read. And finally, if you're interested in Hessian prisoners of war, you can look at Daniel Krebs's Merciful Enemy, and that looks at the experiences of Hessian prisoners in the American interior during the Revolution, and how a lot of them actually ended up incorporating themselves into the American fabric and choosing to stay in America after the Revolution, which is really interesting given some of the atrocities that some of them did endure. But it's a fascinating read as well. So I would recommend those 3.
That's awesome. Brynne, thank you so much for being on and giving us this topic to discuss in the future. I know we have a lot of people in the comments who loved what you've done here. And even though the conference you were supposed to be at to present was canceled or delayed, we're glad that you took the time to be with us and do this, because I think this is very important for all of us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for the comments, the questions. It will be posted on the Facebook site. So Brynne, if you have any time this weekend or in the next few days, you can look back and, answer any questions that we may not have gotten to or anything like that. If you have time, no pressure. If not, I'll answer them and I'll just talk about the First World War the entire time. But thank you again. And thank you everyone in the comments. Please join us in another half hour for another presentation. And don't forget to go check out our sponsor today, TR Historical. Dave's got some awesome stuff, especially Rev War stuff. There's a lot of Rev War goodies over there, but we need loyalists. We need to get on him about that.
It's fantastic. It's so cool. And they've got John stuff as well. So if y'all want a cool tattooed historian sticker, which I have just bought mine. Seriously, they've got some really cool stuff up there, y'all. Check out TR Historical.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brynne. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, John.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you in about a half hour.